Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to today's sohbet on this, the 27th of January 2025. I hope you are well, wherever you're tuning into this from. Today, I had a very interesting discussion with one of our students here at the university who's studying theology. And it covered a number of things around how Islam is practiced in different countries. That's both traditional Muslim countries and also here in the West, and how there are differences. She was also questioning like modes of dress, and she was saying like people question like how she dresses and how she presents herself, as if, is that Islamic? Is that really Islamic enough? What does Islam really say? Um, and this got me thinking about how Islam has developed around the world. Islam is not a monolith. It's like, yes, all Muslims believe in the same kalama shahada. We believe that there's only one Allah and that there's prophets that Allah has inspired to guide humanity. But the expression of Islam, how Islam has grown and developed in one country or another, does vary. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Holy Quran, in Surah Hujurat, which is Surah 49, verse 13. O mankind, indeed we have created you from male and female, and made you peoples and tribes, that you may come to know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. Indeed, Allah is knowing and aware. So here, Allah is talking about a human family, humankind, and that Allah has made us from male and female, this equality between the genders, male and female, and made you into peoples and tribes, people or nations and tribes, that we may come to know one another. The noblest of us is the most righteous. It's not about our culture, our dress sense, the language we speak most of the time. It's about the content of our character, as indeed this wonderful little book translated by Sheikh Hamza Youssef says on its title. It's a book of hadith. I highly recommend it. The content of character. Ethical sayings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu. And this is a translation that was collected by Sheikh Amin Ali Masrui. But this is translated with an introduction by Sheikh Hamza Youssef. And this is the key. It's the content of our character. That's what it means by the most righteous of us. Yeah, it can mean God conscious as well, but it's also about the content of our character. What kind of people are we? And so we are not told or advised to follow only a certain way of doing everything everywhere around the world. Islam acknowledges human diversity, and as Muslims, we share the universal guidance of the Qur'an and Sunnah. But how these are applied and understood is very important. And if they're understood well, they will reflect the cultural context, not just the cultural context in which the Quran was initially revealed and those hadith, the accounts of which those hadiths narrate originally happened, but the cultural context in which we live, in which I live in England, in which my friends live in Indonesia, and my other friends live in the United States, It will reflect their context, how they interpret the Quran and the Hadith for their cultural context, for the situations they face, will vary. And this is not a new thing. This is something which has been the case ever since the earliest days of Islam. The Quran is our unchanging divine guide. The Quran itself hasn't changed for 1400 years. And this in itself is a miracle. I mean, and anybody who's interested in that, they can always come and visit us here at the University of Birmingham at the Cadbury Research Library, where we actually have carbon dated pages of the Quran, where the what's it called, the material that the Quran is written on, the parchment, that dates back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And people today can read those pages of the Quran. So the Quran is our unchanging guide. But as Allah tells us in the Quran, that He intends for us ease, and He does not intend for us hardship. And this establishes a fundamental principle of Islam. There are some expressions of various religions around the world that put an emphasis on things like monasticism or on fasting, not just like we do for 1 month a year, but really like fasting, and then when we eat, only eating tiny amounts of food for really extended periods of time in order to attain higher states of consciousness or awareness. Islam does not teach that. Islam doesn't advocate for us to put ourselves through unnecessary hardship. The teaching in the Quran is much more practical and advocates ease. It doesn't promote creating difficulties, whether that's difficulties in our personal life or whether that's in relation to other people around us. The Quran also provides general values like justice, mercy, public welfare, rather than detailing like rigid points that have to be explicitly followed in all cases, but the general guideline. Justice is a general guideline. How justice is practiced in one place or another will vary. The way the courts are organized, the judicial process, all these things will vary from one country to another country. But the important thing is the establishment of justice, that there is a fair process, and that justice is seen to be done at the end of the day, and the people who are genuinely guilty, they get sentenced, and the people who are genuinely victims, they get supported. But the Quran doesn't stipulate exactly on everything how that needs to be. And even if it did, it would only have done so for things that were known in the 7th century, 1400 years ago. It doesn't. It gives general principles, which is why that they can be applied even today with no difficulty, actually, with a fairly easily. Whereas if it was a set of very specific rules that had to be applied with great detail, then that would create difficulty. So this is also a proof within the Quran itself that Allah is not intending difficulty for us, but Allah intends ease. Now, of course, then you have the practice of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu, which is what is actually the Sunnah. The Sunnah isn't actually the Hadith themselves. The Sunnah is the practice of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu and the wisdom of the Prophet Sallallahu. The Hadith are recordings of various accounts. And the Sunnah complements the Quran by showing how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, applied the guidance of the Quran within his own life. So, for instance, there is the concept of marriage. Concept of marriage is something which is, of course, found in all societies, but as far as I'm aware. But we have a certain practice of marriage that's advocated to us in the Quran. And as part of marriage, you have to give a gift. The groom has to give a gift to the wife, or the bride, the wife to be. And that gift is supposed to be something that is of some real value. And yet the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu, even though this is the teaching and this is the general guidance, because that's also the security. If anything goes wrong with the marriage, this was extremely important, 1400 years ago, even more than it is today, when maybe a lot of women didn't work in the same way we do today, didn't necessarily earn good wages, didn't necessarily have other securities. And if their husband left them, what security, what income would they have? So this gift was really a security for the woman as well. But the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ also showed a flexibility, even given this importance. And there was an example where a man wanted to marry a woman and she was happy to marry him, but that man didn't have wealth. He was very poor. And the Prophet Muhammad وسلم, asked him to offer whatever was within his means, whatever was in his ability to offer. And so even if it was something as small as an iron ring. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was taking account of the fact that this man didn't have much means. And again, that wasn't exactly uncommon in 7th century Arabia. But the Prophet, peace be upon him, showed a flexibility there. Now, of course, if the man had means, offering something as small as an iron ring would be an absolute disgrace. But for that man, that iron ring was incredibly valuable because he had hardly anything. And it was a token of his dedication to the marriage, that he was serious. And this was the main thing. And then afterwards, the couple can work it out between themselves. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, obviously knew much more about each of these individuals than we do today when he arrived at that decision. And if you'd have thought that that would have created a problem, or he foresaw that, or the woman would have been left destitute or anything like that, of course, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, I should imagine, would not have done that. But he obviously knew about these things and made a decision based upon that. Yet, if we didn't have that hadith, if that hadn't reached us, because bearing in mind, these hadith were recorded afterwards. And these hadith, we are relying on the hadith collectors, and there were a number of hadith that they discarded. And even amongst the hadith that they collected, they are categorized in order of their veracity, from Sahih, Hasan, Daif, from like really authentic to, or they're considered really authentic, considered good, and considered weak. And this is also the meaning of the hadith, but it's also the You have to do the same thing with both the meaning of the hadith and also with its isnad, with its chain. Now, if that hadith hadn't reached us, though, we wouldn't have this example. And then people might be rigidly adhering to a concept that that gift must always be valuable in all contexts, in all societies. Even when a man and a woman get married, and the woman is earning a lot more than the man. But if they're happy to get married, why should that stop the marriage? In the modern world, it's not unusual for couples to, who are getting married, for the woman to be actually earning a lot more than the man, or to come from a more wealthy background. This is a context which has changed. It's not unusual within modern societies, especially within the Western world, but not exclusively, for there to be more supports in place, both within the judicial system and also within the state itself, to offer more support to women when they are on their own, when they are single parents, and in all of these situations. So a context has changed there. And so the way we actually arrive at fiqh rulings specific for those societies should take that into account. Because clearly we are talking about completely different situations. So much has changed that you could actually describe them as completely different. So this is a misunderstanding a lot of people have, because Sharia is, of course, establishing justice it's a command in the Quran. It's something we are commanded to do. We're implored to do. Sharia is seen as divine law. But on the other hand, fiqh is the human understanding of it. And that is shaped by reasoning and cultural realities. It's still Sharia. But Sharia is not something which is fixed in stone. It's not something which, in its detail, I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about what is right and what is wrong. To murder someone is wrong in, I think, pretty much every society and every religion on the earth, and has been for millennia, even long before Islam. Certain things like this do not change, or do not change markedly. Theft is seen as wrong in all societies and a punishable offense. So many of these things are actually universal. But although Sharia is divine law, although right and wrong, the big things are usually very clear, but like the smaller things, the detail, which varies according to circumstances, this is why, fiqh needs human understanding, and it needs to be contextualized. It needs reasoning. It needs people to adjust to the cultural realities, to take that into account. And this is not something which is new. From the earliest days of Islam, cultural context was taken into account. This was even when Caliph Umar, during the famine, when he suspended the punishment for theft, because he recognized that this punishment for theft would be unjust in those dire circumstances. How can you punish people for stealing food when they are starving? People do things out of desperation that they're not really even intending to steal. They're starving. And so he recognized that in that desperate situation, that would be unjust. But technically, you could say that Caliph Umar not punishing people for theft was a violation of at least an interpretation of Sharia. But who's going to question Caliph Umar? Then you've got examples from the lives of the Imams. You know, the Imams of fiqh themselves, from Maliki, Shafi, Hanbali. These Imams also relied heavily on reasoning, qiyas, and the customs of their environment, especially Imam Abu Hanifa. And then you've got the principles of usul al-fiqh, maslaha, public interest. What is the public interest? A modern example of this is how Islamic finance has been developed according to the modern circumstances in which we find ourselves. Literally, there is nowhere in the world that finance is done in the same way as it was during the 7th century. Why would it be? 1400 years have passed. So many developments, both technological and cultural and social, have happened in that time. So, you know, modern Islamic scholars have had to come together and develop new Islamic finance tools developed around the modern economic realities while adhering to principles from the Sharia. You could call all of this bid'ah. And indeed it is. But it is bid'ah that is acceptable bid'ah. It is bid'ah hasana. It's good bid'ah. It's bid'ah because it's in the public interest. I mean, it's bid'ah because it's an innovation, but it's good because it's in the public interest. People need these tools. People need finance. People need to get on with their lives. People need to conduct business. People literally need to eat. They need places to live. They need to live. So scholars today have had to rethink some of these things. And Sharia has a mechanism to do that. The customary practices. Local customs are valid unless they contradict Islamic principles. So for instance, if you look at traditional clothing styles around the Muslim world, how Muslims traditionally, and I'm not talking about it now because everybody tends to wear a lot of modern clothing, which is based roughly on a Western model. But I mean, if you go back a couple of hundred years ago, look at the historical clothes that were worn in Morocco. I mean, these are often still kept alive as folk clothing. Look at the traditional styles that were worn in Morocco, in Mauritania, in various of the North African countries, in Turkey, in Saudi, in Palestine, in Indonesia, in India, in all these places. They were different, quite markedly different in many cases. Yet these were clothes that Muslims had traditionally worn for generations, for hundreds of years. They were not all dressed the same way. And so this was acceptable as long as they met certain standards of modesty that were accepted by the scholars that were in charge of those communities or guiding those communities at the time. And then there's the issue of durura, or necessity. Necessity permits exceptions. Even things which are not halal in other situations, in normal situations, for instance, in normal situations, like for instance, if I was to go and get myself a bacon sandwich now, that would be haram. I don't want it either, but you get the point. I mean, unless it was turkey bacon or something, it's like that would be haram for me. If literally I was stuck on a desert island and there was nothing else to eat, and that was the only thing to eat, in Sharia, that becomes halal as long as those extraordinary circumstances exist. Not only does it become halal, the Sharia actually implores me that I have to eat it if it keeps me alive. no matter how disgusting that might be. If you doubt it, go and ask other scholars, they will tell you. So necessity permits exceptions. Now, this is an extreme example, and I'm deliberately giving an extreme example, because if it applies in the case of an extreme example, then it certainly applies in much more moderate examples. So, for instance, not something as haram as a bacon sandwich, but something which is maybe disliked, or something which, in other situations, in maybe traditional Muslim society or something, would not be the done thing, but okay, maybe in another society, that's how they go about things. It's not something which is seen as seriously haram, but then some people do. Things like that, you can work around depending on the situation. So, I mean, these are just a few examples. And I mean, there's a lot more that we could go into on this. But it just concerned me that how people don't seem to understand this thing about Sharia. That certainly there are people who do, but there's a lot of people that don't seem to understand Sharia is not something that's set in stone. Also, Sharia is not the be-all and end-all of Islam, because we've got to do tazkiyah an-nafs. We need to develop our iman. This is not Sharia. This is other aspects of Islam. Sharia is important, but it's like a tool which helps us to organize ourselves, organize our society. It's a tool. It's not something which is what should be the main focus of everything that we do. If we only have a legalistic approach to our faith, how are we going to develop taqwa? Taqwa is God consciousness. And it's people focusing so much not just on the Sharia, but on the minutiae of the Sharia. The minutiae of the Sharia that were derived in a different society at a different time and place, based upon the local customs of that society. Perhaps as Imam Malik, he focused on the customs of the people of Medina, because he saw this as being closest to the Prophet Muhammad. Was good, alhamdulillah, but I mean, how does that always help us in every other cultural context if we literally applied that then to other cultures? But actually, if we understand that also Imam Malik was also looking at the cultural context in his own way and understanding that and trying to derive what wisdom he could from it, that then others can then derive that wisdom in their rulings and understandings elsewhere. So these are just important considerations we have to make. And so when we also meet Muslims from other communities and other societies, whether that be from Indonesia or Morocco or Mauritania or Saudi Arabia or America or anywhere, we need to consider that everybody has their own culture. And some of these are very traditional cultures and traditional, like Islamic schools and things that have developed over long periods of time. That's where they've derived, they're from their traditional Islamic seminaries and pesantrans over centuries. And they've come to these understandings and rulings based upon a lot more study than any of their critics are giving you. So we should take all that into account before we jump to a conclusion and question, but is that really Islamic, what you're wearing? Have you researched it? If you haven't researched it, how can you speak on it? May Allah forgive us all. We've all had moments when we've jumped to conclusions, when we've made mistakes. May Allah guide us from making such mistakes and help us to be constructive in all of our interactions with other people. And for those who are responsible for drawing up fiqh and jurisprudence. May Allah help them to also come to good rulings and good understandings. May Allah forgive us all and guide us all. And may we not be misguided after we've been guided. حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل والقلوب لا قوة إلا بالله العظيم الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you found that useful. May Allah bless you all. Have a wonderful week and a wonderful evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.